Papa Murphy's $7.99 everyday value lineup of take and bake pizzas are, well, a pretty big deal for a pretty small price. We're talking big savings on big flavors, like our new bold shredded pepperoni pizza, crumbled sausage pizza, or classic cheese pizza, all for the small price of $7.99 each. So head to Papa Murphy's, because with freshly made large pizzas at this price, you can afford to bake a big-time deliciousness all day, every day. Papa Murphy's, change the way you pizza.
This is a Queen Bee Radio High School sports presentation.
It's time for another edition of the Papa Murphy's of Platteville and Prairie du Chien High School Football Roundup on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. A very busy week 4 and a very fun week 5 coming up in high school football this week. Our starting lineup today, we have Gary Craugh, Matthew Goninen, and have game well-traveled Steve Prestegard joining us for our show today. Remember to check out Papa Murphy's $7.99 everyday value lineup. It's a big deal for a small price. We're talking a large pizza with new shredded pepperoni, crumbled sausage, or classic cheese for $7.99 each, which means you can afford big-time deliciousness at Papa Murphy's in Platteville and Prairie du Chien. Let's start things off in the SWAL. Matthew, you and I, we got to call a fun matchup in Cuba City. Mineral Point taking on Cuba City on Super Hits 106 and the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. Again, we kind of had expectations that it might be a closer game with it being a rivalry game, but Cuba City coming away with the 42-0 win over Mineral Point. Cuba City flexing their muscle, really winning in all three phases of the game, although there were some moments for Cuba City where they had a couple chances to put the ball in the end zone at the goal line, but a fumble resulted in a touchback, and then a goal line stand by Mineral Point turned Cuba City away. So the Cubans do have a couple things to tighten up heading into this matchup coming up this weekend with Southwestern East Dubuque. But the initial reaction and thoughts of Cuba City's performance over Mineral Point, Matthew?
Well, I thought I was very impressed with Cuba City, especially with how they performed in the second half against Mineral Point. Offensively, just like usual, Andy Leffelholtz in the offensive line, very strong. And Tyson Richard, as you mentioned on our broadcast last week, Tyler, he connected with 6 different targets passing the ball. So very strong performance from him as well. And just besides that, they forced Mineral Point into a lot of bad situations. The Pointers fumbled the ball away twice, and they threw a pick 6 to Gavin Vossen. And even on special teams, we were talking with Coach Kopp at the end of the game and how we decided to open up the second half with the onside kick, which they recovered, and then blocking the Mineral Point punt in the end zone to score a touchdown. So in all 3 phases of the game, it was really good for Cuba City. And they've just been doing a great job this year of leaning on their strengths and leaning on their depth and letting that carry them.
Yeah, it's funny, when we were talking with Coach Kopp during postgame, he mentioned that Landon Bush has not missed an extra point, has not missed a field goal, and executed that onside kick to perfection. That is a weapon for Cuba City. And, you know, again, something that teams have to prepare for, that Cuba City has a long ball field goal kicker, that Cuba City can get points, even if they don't punch it in the end zone. So that's something that a lot of teams have to account for. That seems, rather uncommon in this area, especially among our Division 6 and Division 7 teams. So yeah, Landon Bush, an outstanding player, but yeah, all 3 phases of the game for Cuba City, really dominant, really from start to finish. A lot of the opportunities that Mineral Point had seemed to come off either Cuba City penalties or miscues and things like that. But for Mineral Point, they were just unable to capitalize. And, looking ahead for Mineral Point, they've got Belleville coming up this Friday night, which, Belleville has not had the season that I think any of us really anticipated. Belleville currently 1-1 in the SWAL, 1-4 overall. So this is a winnable game for Mineral Point. With your, input and the way that you see things playing out for Mineral Point with the games that you've seen from them, what areas do you think Mineral Point is going to be emphasizing on heading into that matchup against Belleville?
Well, I think for Mineral Point, the question all year has been, what is your offensive identity? And when you lose the SWAL MVP at quarterback, all 4 of your starting wide receivers, and your starting running back to graduation, it's tough to figure out what you're going to be on offense. And we saw that with Cuba City. They had started Reed Ackerman at quarterback in their first 3 games, but with an injury that Ackerman sustained against Darlington, they made the switch to the freshman Liam Carey at quarterback, which his play style being a little different than Ackerman, who's more run focused and takes some reps at running back, is going to lead to some different play calls. So I think for Mineral Point against Belleville, which, as you mentioned, they think is a very doable game, that they can stay in that one and challenge Belleville for a win, it's really going to come down to who's at quarterback and then game planning this week around whoever is starting, whether they're going to focus on run or mix in a little more of the pass. But the key to Mineral Point finding success is really finding their offensive identity, because the rest of the team has stayed fairly consistent for them in my eyes.
Yeah, one of the bigger things that I noticed during the game against Cuba City is that Mineral Point struggled on first and second down, which made things very tough to convert those longer, third down conversions. There were a couple, passes here and there that, went their way, early on in the game. And then, of course, Cuba City had 2 back-to-back personal foul penalties that put, Mineral Point, near the Bitech green zone on one drive, but they were just unable to, move the football and get it into the end zone. But I think, you mentioned, who's going to be at quarterback and what their offensive identity is. From what I've seen in the 2 games that Mineral Point has played, I think that there's something there with Liam Carey. I think that, it's just that he's inexperienced, and it's just been tough for him to really get comfortable and get things set up. And it's probably in large part because, the weapons at running back and wide receiver just have not been overly consistent there. But I do think that Mineral Point has something there. It's just, how do you make it work? And as we also said during the broadcast, it's not like Mineral Point's, playing cupcakes or anything like that. They are playing the best of the best in our area, and that schedule doesn't get really any easier. Belleville, as we said, a winnable game for them based on their record and what we've seen, comparatively against similar opponents. But yeah, Mineral Point, if they can get that offense together and find that identity and stick with it, there might be some opportunity for them down the line to still potentially get into the postseason. So there's still a lot of games left to play and a lot of work that can be done. We've seen teams, turn things around rather quickly. So we'll keep tabs on Mineral Point the rest of the season. The other matchup in the SWAL that kind of really influenced the standings was Southwestern East Dubuque at Darlington. And I think that this was going to be the first real big test for Southwestern East Dubuque in the SWAL. Again, when you're playing the reigning Division VI state runner-up, that's obviously going to be the top of the weight class, so to speak, in the SWAL. And Darlington came away with the win rather easily, 43-12 over Southwestern East Dubuque. Southwestern East Dubuque's first loss of the season, and Darlington seeming to be getting things back on the right track with the way that they played. Matthew, what were your takeaways from Darlington's win over Southwestern East Dubuque last Friday night?
I think Darlington has been continuously getting better and better as the year has gone on. And one of the interesting things to me is just how compared to Mineral Point, they really know their identity and know what they're working with, and they were able to really lean into that. Zeke Zuberbuehler, really impressive. He had 2 rushing touchdowns, one of them fairly long, and a passing touchdown. But the kind of thing that surprised me in their first game when I saw he only threw 5 passes is, once again, this week, he was 5 for 7. He doesn't have to throw many passes, and that's because they've got Callum Christ at running back. 15 attempts, 110 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So when you've got that kind of player at running back, some of the other weapons that they can throw around in some of those run schemes, you don't really have to lean on Zuberbuehler that much, and I think that allows him to be successful in that position as a game manager for Darlington. They can make some big plays when they need him to. And on the other end for Southwestern East Dubuque, they went 3-0 to start the year off, and they do have some really solid pieces. Now, there are going to be some tough SWAL opponents that they're going to run into down the line, but the hopes to make a playoff push is still definitely alive for them, and they shouldn't feel bad after losing to one of the best teams in the area. So they just got to go back to the drawing board and see what they can do for this coming week.
Yeah, sometimes it's not about losing, it's about how you respond to losses, and sometimes a loss can be a blessing in disguise for teams, as we've seen for some of our local teams, especially last year. Recapping the other scores in the SWAL from last week, Fenimore wins a thriller against Benton Scales Mount Shullsburg 40-38, and Lake Mills defeats Belleville 40-20. That was the makeup game for Belleville, who would have played Abundant Life St. Ambrose, but Abundant Life St. Ambrose is playing 8-player football. We've discussed that multiple times. which sets up the matchups that we have coming up this Friday night. And we've got a good one in Hazel Green, Cuba City taking on Southwestern East Dubuque on Super Hits 106 and technology permitting on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. Myself and Gary Craugh will have the call. And Gary, this is a very intriguing matchup, again, just because of the fact that Southwestern East Dubuque lost last week to Darlington. And this is one of those contender-pretender type of games for Southwestern East Dubuque, that if you're going to be in the conference title picture, you got to take down one of the better teams in the conference. You and I have seen Cuba City against Lancaster. I saw them against Mineral Point last week. What do you make of the matchup between these two teams on Friday night?
Well, as you said, I think Southwestern East Dubuque had some high expectations going up against Darlington. They found out what Darlington is made of, and I mean, they did show themselves well. The score wouldn't indicate that, but you know, they're a young team. They've got some, as Matthew said, they've got some pieces. But then again, as you and I have seen Cuba City and what they did to Lancaster on Cuba City's home field, that was something that neither of us expected. And Southwestern East Dubuque is going to have another challenge just like they had last week. If the defense can do anything to try and slow down the Cuban offense, especially Leffelholtz, they may have a chance, but Cuba City presents a pretty strong opponent.
Yeah, it should be a great matchup. Cuba City at Southwestern East Dubuque coming up on Friday night on Super Hits 106. And if we can get the Huddle Cam to work on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel as well. Another matchup in the SWAL we have coming up, we have Fenimore at Galena. That'll be on Extreme 107.1. Steve, you got to see Fenimore in their season opener against Iowa Grant, taking on Galena. That's a makeup game for the Abundant Life St. Ambrose team not playing. On the onset, with Fenimore coming off that win against Benton Scales Mountain Schellsburg, what do you make of Fenimore so far with their 2-1 record in conference and 3-2 overall?
Well, obviously they're a hair inconsistent. You know, they played they played Iowa Grant, and it was kind of less a case of Fenimore playing well as Iowa Grant not. Now, of course, Iowa Grant has gotten considerably better, but Fenimore has been kind of up and down. But they are certainly, you would think, capable of being that 3 or 4 win team in terms of conference record to get into the playoffs. They've got good enough players to do that. And of course, what's interesting here is that they're playing with all of these games against teams that are not in the area. You're playing a team that you don't really know very much about. I'm sure they've seen huddle video and you know, they've been able to scout from that. But, you know, oftentimes you look at a team based on, well, what did they do last year and who's not back from last year? Well, they kind of don't have that, because a year ago from now, this was going to be Fenimore playing Abundant Life St. Ambrose, and playing Galena or anybody else was not on anybody's radar until they made the somewhat late decision to keep an A player. It's kind of a free game in the sense for Fenimore, because of course they're getting the forfeit win. Mm-hmm. And Galena, unfortunately, is not the Galena they used to be. You know, they've won state titles down in Galena in football. They haven't done very much recently, however. And at least early on this season, they kind of got off to not a great start. So it's very much an up in the air kind of game, as far as neither team really knows very much about each other. So I guess it kind of sort of fits in as a playoff game, kind of set up in the sense of not really knowing very much about each other's team.
And it's probably more of an opportunity for both teams to just kind of focus on themselves and execute their own game plans, work on the things that they want to do to improve down the home stretch of the season. Fenimore at Galena will be on Extreme 107.1 on Friday night. And then wrapping up our SWAL coverage for this week, Darlington at Benton Scales Mount Schellsburg. Steve, you've seen both teams and broadcasted games for both. What do you make of this matchup?
Well, Darlington is playing quite well right now. Benton Scales Mount Schellsburg was really dominated when I saw them by Stockton, and Stockton got beat by Lena Winslow last week. Now, that's not really a surprise because Lena Winslow is very good, but they're going to have to get the game of their lives basically from their offensive and defensive lines to have any shot at all against Darlington. That was kind of the main problem when the Knights played Stockton, as you and I both saw. And it's going to be, I'm afraid it's going to be a rough one for the Knights.
Yep, Darlington at Benton Scalesville and Schallsburg coming up on Friday night as well. And then a recap of the games that we'll have on Queen Bee Radio for the SWAL. We have Cuba City at Southwestern East Dubuque on Super Hits 106 and the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. Fenimore at Galena on Extreme 107.1. Let's move into the SWC where Prairie du Chien took on Platteville, and Prairie du Chien came away with a blowout win, 41-13. Steve, you were there to call the game. Looking at the stats from that game, it seems like it was the Blake Thierry show, getting 200 yards rushing and 4 touchdowns on his stat line. Talk about what you saw from Prairie du Chien and what do things look like for both teams heading down the home stretch of the season.
Well, Prairie du Chien is they play the same basically that they have played before, but let's face it, if you gave any coach a 225-pound running back who's got decent speed, you're going to figure out how to use him to your advantage. And I believe actually he didn't have that many carries, but he's impossible to tackle. That just because of his size. And he was able to score on short runs, and he scored on a 65-yard run, which really ended up snuffing out any kind of momentum that Platteville had. They got a 64-yard touchdown pass to Lucas Ludlum that cut the deficit to 2 scores in the second quarter, and that lasted until the next offensive play when Thierry ran off for 65 yards and the score. And then suddenly got your 3-score margin back. The other thing was that Prairie du Chien's offensive line, even though they had people that were new coming in, once again played well. And Platteville continues to have, I think they continue to have problems with their offensive line. That's kind of the common denominator when you can't run like you were used to running, and your quarterback doesn't have the time to throw and is hurried and all of that. So that's Platteville's situation. If you're a Hillman fan, obviously you want it to get better, but it's not like you can bring guys in off the street to play for Platteville at this point. You have what you have, essentially. They do have some injury problems on both the offensive line and on the defense, and that posed some problems for Platteville as well against Prairie du Chien. But the other thing about Prairie du Chien that helps them is they have a favorable schedule, and by that I mean the timing of who they are playing. I mean, everybody plays everybody else, obviously, in a conference, but they are not playing Lancaster until the last game of the season. So there are a few teams that they will be favored against, to say the least, coming up. And that helps them because if they have some banged up players, although they haven't to this point, they'll have time to become healthy and all of that. So things are working well for Prairie du Chien, put it this way, to win the title, or at least to be in a position to win the title at the end of the season.
Based on what you've seen and what their resume looks like, I think on paper it looks like it's Prairie du Chien's conference to lose. Is that how you feel after seeing the game against Platteville?
Well, I'm not positive about that because there are a couple of question marks out there. Now, they play River Valley, which has been kind of surprisingly, they've kind of exceeded expectations so far this year, and they get them actually on Friday. Lancaster, I think a lot of it will depend on what happens Friday against Platteville because, and the irony of that is that, the biggest Platteville fans are going to be, other than Platteville fans on Friday, Prairie du Chien fans.
Yeah.
Because, that could conceivably, if Platteville beats Lancaster Friday night, that could give they could plop Prairie du Chien in the driver's seat to win the title. If Lancaster wins, then you have 2 teams that are still unbeaten. And, we haven't talked about what River Valley could end up doing or anything like that. But at this point, they're one of the favorites, but Lancaster is obviously also one of the favorites. And then River Valley continues to be a big question mark, basically. And Friday is going to tell a lot.
Yep, agreed. Let's talk about the Lancaster Flying Arrows now as they defeated Richland Center on Friday night, 48-12 or 28-12. Was it 28-12? Yep, I wrote it down on my
28-12, yeah.
Yep. So 28-12, Gary, you were there. You can verify what the score was. You called the game. Tell us about what happened in that matchup between Lancaster and Richland Center.
Well, I was a little bit surprised both ways. Lancaster, to me, kind of looked in the first half, kind of like they did against Cuba City. They moved the ball a little bit, but the other way that I was surprised is Richland Center's defense came to play. Anything that Lancaster earned that first half, anything they got, they earned. At the end of the first quarter, it was 7-0, and it should have really been 7-all. Richland Center had taken a punt at their own 20 and ran it back for a touchdown, but it was called back because of a block in the back, so they brought the ball back it was a 70-yard return, and they brought the ball back to the 20 and started from there. Richland Center had some opportunities, but they just shot themselves in the foot so many times with holding calls, especially on offense. Lancaster did kind of get it going a little bit. They were ahead 14-7 at half. The biggest thing for Lancaster, however, they did lose their wide receiver, Taylor Williams. It was either the first or second play that they had offensively. There was a pass that was wide of Williams. He flat out laid himself out flying for the ball, came down and broke his collarbone. So he's gone for the year. And after that, they just had a hard time getting any kind of continuity with the receivers. The running game did pick up. The offensive line for Lancaster did finally kind of start to establish themselves. And toward the third quarter, it was pretty obvious that Richland Center's defense was just plain getting wore out. Give them credit. I mean, they stood a lot of tests against the Flying Arrows, but Lancaster, to me, really, as I said before, looked like that Lancaster team that played Cuba City. They just didn't really get themselves in gear and were stymied by a pretty decent defense, but not, I wouldn't say an outstanding defense, but Richland Center, I think, played probably one of their better defensive games of the year.
Yeah, Taylor Williams has gone for Lancaster. That's a pretty big loss. He's one of their, athletes on the perimeter. And, in addition to that, he's an outstanding basketball player too. So you hope that he can hopefully come back in good condition for basketball season, down the line as well. But,
Now I did see a report, was it yesterday, and I couldn't find it again today, but it said that Williams is going in for surgery yesterday. So if he had to go in for surgery to fix a broken collarbone, then he's going to be out for a while.
Right. Yeah. That's a tough loss for Lancaster the rest of the way, but Lancaster did get the win over Richland Center, 28-12. Other scores in the SWC: New Glarus defeated Dodgeville 43-22, and River Valley squeaks by Broadhead Judah 22-20. So the standings in the SWC: Lancaster and Prairie du Chien tied for first place with 2-0 conference records, with River Valley also at 2-0. New Glarus and Platteville with 1-2 records, and then Dodgeville, Richland Center, and Broadhead Judah all with 0-2 records heading into week 5, which we have a big-time matchup on 97.7 Country WGLR. Platteville is at Lancaster. Steve, you will have the call of that. And, I think we kind of mentioned this last week with the matchup against Prairie du Chien, that this was a, contender versus pretender matchup. I think now this is, for Platteville to kind of salvage, what's been a disappointing season, try and get a big win against a familiar rival in the SWC.
Well, familiar is absolutely correct. These two teams have been playing each other since, believe it or not, 1902. And with 1 year's exception, which was 2021, they've been conference rivals all of this time. So, and there have been a few seasons when there were some scheduling issues where they actually played twice.
Yep.
Typically, they have been, there have been a couple instances or a few instances where they shared the conference title. It's a great series as far as history goes. That's one of the fun things about it. The other fun thing about it is, of course, what happened last year. Final score, Platteville 47, Lancaster 46. You may remember that was a football game where Lancaster failed to score on one drive in the entire football game. But their problem was that they ended up going 2 for 7 in 2-point conversions. And if any one of those 5 fails had been successes, including the last one, then Lancaster would have won the title instead of Platteville. So that kind of adds spice to the whole thing about Friday. Certainly, the Arrows. What's interesting about them is that if you look at their stats, they don't look anything like a typical Arrows team because, and I'm not seeing the stats for Friday's game yet, but after the first 3 weeks of the season, they had more passing yards than rushing yards, and they had more passing attempts than rushes. And John Hoke may be up wherever he is now. Maybe he's like, what in the world's going on here? But Jordan Ronald obviously has decided that this is the way for them to be the most successful. They have a lot of graduations on their offensive line, but they have a lot of skilled people, great quarterback coming back, and he's figured out that that's the formula. And they're 3-1 overall, so that does seem to be the formula, unless you happen to play really poorly as they did against Cuba City. So again, Lancaster, if they win, they keep pace with Prairie du Chien or whoever wins Prairie du Chien and River Valley, I suppose. And Platteville, if they want to have any influence at all on what happens in the conference as far as getting the title, they've got to win that game on Friday. And that's not going to be an easy task, obviously, for numerous reasons.
Yeah, you mentioned that game last year, that final 2-point conversion, this close to going in favor of Lancaster last year. And again, that 2-point conversion ultimately decided the conference, when you think about it, and then that influenced, how each team got seeded in their, respective divisions. So it was literally a game of inches, the last meeting between these two. Looking forward to seeing how the rematch this year goes. It'll be Platteville at Lancaster on 97.7 Country WGLR and the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. Steve, you were also mentioning another matchup in the SWC to keep tabs on, River Valley at Prairie du Chien. Both teams, again, 2-0. We'll kind of see how good River Valley is compared to Prairie du Chien. Again, I think Prairie du Chien is, probably the leader in the SWC at this point, just based on who they've played and what the results of the games have been. Also keep tabs on Richland Center at New Glarus and at Dodgeville at Broadhead, Judah. And that wraps up our... go ahead.
Obviously, Tyler, it's obvious to everybody that the Blackhawks are going to win that game between Prairie and Valley on Friday.
I forgot to set you up for that. My apologies.
That's sad, Steve. That's sad.
We missed out on the Chieftains one a couple weeks ago, and I forgot to set you up for that. My apologies. I will make sure it doesn't happen again, but please make sure to call me out on it going ahead. All right, so that wraps up the SWC recap and preview. Let's go to the Six Rivers Conference, where, again, the conference title picture is really starting to take shape just because of the matchups that River Ridge had to open conference play. They fell to Blackhawk Warren 26-20 2 weeks ago, and then last week they fell to Potosi Cassville 20-18. And when I look at the stats and the way that the game played out, there's a pattern that I'm noticing with the River Ridge Timberwolves in the way that their season has played out. When you look at how the team plays in the first half of games, they have outscored their opponents 77-0. In the second half, they are being outscored 54-38. So you have teams that are playing really well in the first half. They start strong, but then tend to fizzle out in the second half. The other piece to this is that as competitive as these matchups between River Ridge and Potosi-Cassville have been, Potosi-Cassville has won the last 7 matchups head-to-head. The last time River Ridge defeated Potosi-Cassville was November 1st of 2019, which is 1,784 days ago as of when this podcast drops on Thursday. So with that in mind, we now know it's basically Potosi-Cassville and Blackhawk Warren. They're going to have the head-to-head matchup to pretty much decide the conference title. I don't anticipate Potosi-Cassville or Blackhawk Warren losing to any of the other teams in the Six Rivers the rest of the way leading into that matchup. But the thing that I find really interesting is this might end up being a blessing in disguise for River Ridge, because they now have 5 weeks to get things straightened out, to focus on the things that have cost them games against the toughest competition that they'll face all season. You know, the schedule for River Ridge, obviously very favorable. They're playing the, teams in the Six Rivers that were formerly, Ridge and Valley, or are, opponents that are not necessarily the caliber of River Ridge. But I think that this is a great opportunity for the River Ridge Timberwolves to really focus in and really focus on closing out opponents and playing strong football in the second halves of football games. Steve, you've been on the call of a few Potosi-Cassville and River Ridge games over, the last couple seasons. We know about the brand of football that both programs bring. I don't think the final score is, surprising by any stretch, but I think it is still a rivalry just in the competition that it's been, but Potosi-Cassville has consistently had the edge over the Timberwolves. What did you make of the outcome of the game and just the rivalry between these two teams as a whole?
Well, when you talk about a lot of scoring in the first half and then getting outscored like that in the second half, what that says to me is depth or lack thereof. That, they have skilled players, everybody knows that, and they get off to a good start, but people get worn down, people get hurt. You have to bring people in who are maybe not used to playing. And I think any coach would tell you that it's one thing to go into a game knowing that you have to replace somebody. It is another thing entirely to have somebody go down. And, the reality of Division VII football is typically if somebody goes down, that's 2 starters that you have now lost, and probably a kick returner and kick coverage guy also. And I'm not sure if that's the situation with River Ridge, but that's kind of what it sounds like to me, that they're getting worn down in games because they, don't have enough depth. And that is what it is. There's nothing really that you can necessarily do about that. And conversely, we know how huge Potosi-Cassville's roster is, upwards of 50 players. And so they would have the depth advantage basically going up against anybody who they would happen to play. I don't mean to be disparaging about River Ridge, and I'm really not intending to. But, Packers-Bears is a rivalry also, but it's been an extremely one-sided one. I think it could just be an argument that right now Potosi-Cassville has more players and better players, very simply put, than River Ridge does. And that's, I'm not quite sure what you do about that either, other than maybe getting a bunch of people from Cassville or Potosi to open and roll in River Ridge or whatever. But, you can look at any long-standing rivalry. And actually, we have a good one this week with Platteville and Lancaster. Lancaster dominated for about 20 years, but Platteville still is in front in terms of wins and losses in the rivalry, which says that rivalries are simply, they ebb and flow. There's a team that could end up with, like winning 7 or 8 games in 10 years, and then it flips for whatever reason. So, but as far as the one thing that really stands out from what you said was, again, the scoring difference between the first half and the second half for the Timberwolves, which again sounds to me like a depth issue, and not quite sure what you're going to do about that the rest of the season, because at this point you have what you have.
Yeah, that's the thing with Potosi-Cassville. We talked about it, in our preview episodes about how Potosi-Cassville has over 50 players on their roster, which for a D7 team, that's pretty darn impressive, to have as many players as you have at your disposal. And if you can continuously rotate players in while the opponent doesn't have, as many players, to work with, it can keeping guys fresh. It's a numbers game, so to speak, in these Division 7 matchups, and that's probably where Potosi Cassville has gotten their advantage, and that's what's helped them out in their game against River Ridge. But again, River Ridge being 0-2 in the conference, dropping to two of the top teams, not just in the conference but in the state in Division 7. I don't think this necessarily eliminates River Ridge for the entirety of the season. It takes them out of the conference title picture, but you have a long stretch to really focus in on the things that you can improve on and get ready for a potentially deep postseason run. And maybe revenge is a bit of a factor that can come into play, because I would anticipate that once postseason rolls around, you're going to run into one, if not both, of these teams in the postseason, the way that the seedings have tended to play out over the last couple seasons. So.
Yeah, so we talked about how the schedule has kind of benefited Prairie du Chien. Well, arguably River Ridge is kind of the opposite, because if you have your two biggest rivals for the title and you're playing them back to back at the start of the season, I don't know that a coach would choose to do that, because after 2 weeks, you haven't necessarily gotten everything down, even if you have a veteran team. And they had to play them back to back. It wasn't like they played Blackhawk Warren and then 3 weeks later they get to play Potosi Cassville. Back to back is tough, and it's really tough at the start of the season too.
Yeah, those are probably
too. Excuse me. I mean, the thing is too, though, that it wasn't like they were blown out in either game. They lost by 2 to Potosi Cassville. They lost by 6 to Blackhawk. So if they've got another 4 or 5 weeks, with a little bit more favorable schedule, get some more things figured out, that gives them the opportunity to work on a few more things that if they've got to meet them down the line, making the playoffs, that's going to give them a chance to maybe even the score.
Yeah, definitely. Because if you remember, Blackhawk Warren beat River Ridge on a halfback option touchdown pass at the very end of the game. And, River Ridge could have taken Potosi Cassville to overtime at least, and then who knows what happens if they'd gotten a 2-point conversion at the very end.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. They are conceivably 2 plays from not being 0-2, and that is that I think it's something that Wade Winkers will certainly tell his team, assuming that they get to play Blackhawk Warren or Potosi Cassville in the postseason. That look, we were actually this close to winning the game. Yeah. So that's an absolutely good point.
Yeah, well, going back to the point earlier about Potosi Cassville winning the last 7 matchups head to head, the thing that's really stood out to me, being on the call of most of those, is that with the exception of last postseason's level 2 game where Andrew Nice was out due to injury that he suffered against Highland in level 1 the week before, all the games came down to the final possession. And, it was, River Ridge, going into score, but it ended up being a pick 6 coming back the other way, which resulted in a 2-score margin of victory for Potosi Cassville. The regular season matchup between the two, Potosi Cassville was without Eli Adams and Roman Frederick, and River Ridge had a 26-14 lead heading into the fourth quarter. Then Potosi Cassville scores 20 unanswered points. So, River Ridge is consistently in these games, but it's how do you finish them? I think that's the key. And I don't know if it's necessarily just, overall, execution, or if it's, play calling. I'm sure that there's kind of a mix, among that. But the common thread that I notice is that River Ridge has started strong, but not finished as strong, and teams have been able to get back into those games and ultimately come away with wins. And same applies to Blackhawk Warren too. I mean, the regular season matchup between the two, a 14-6 win for Blackhawk Warren, a rock fight, ground and pound type of game. It does River Ridge no favors that you have 2 of the top teams in your conference, because, again, you can't win every single game, necessarily. But if you're in the mix, of those games, it's finding ways to win them. And I think it has to be a bit frustrating to come so close and, know that you're right there. But, again, I think that this stretch of 5 weeks, the toughest part of the schedule for the regular season is out of the way. it's really honing in on basically preparing for a deep postseason run because, again, I don't necessarily believe that the rest of the teams in the Six Rivers are really going to put up much of a fight against River Ridge the rest of the way. And speaking of the other scores in the Six Rivers Conference, Blackhawk Warren took care of Boscobel easily, 54-9. Seneca Wazeeka Steuben defeats Riverdale 28-7, and Iowa Grant defeating Peck Argyle 38-16. Steve, it kind of feels like the Six Rivers teams that were in the Six Rivers last year are still playing their brand of football, and the teams that came over from the Ridge and Valley are still kind of doing Ridge and Valley type of things, because I still don't really know what to make of some of these head-to-head matchups that we've seen.
Well, I mean, explain Iowa Grant. They looked like they didn't know what they were doing in their first game against Fenimore. They lost their second game, and now they've won 2 in a row. So, it's a head scratcher, but and you're right. It's basically the teams that were Ridge and Valley teams last year that kind of figure out some way to either exceed or fall short of expectations, or based on what you think from one week to another. But again, similar to the SWAL, there are 5 teams who are basically playing for one, maybe, underline that word, 2 playoff spots. And you look and say, well, who is it going to be? At this point, Iowa Grant's probably in charge, which is rather surprising. But Peck Argyle and Wazeeka Steuben Seneca. Yeah, the game I'm doing Saturday, which I just blanked on. Those 2 teams obviously are not out of it either. I think people thought Wazeeka Steuben Seneca was probably the easiest path to get to the 4th place. Well, then they got beat by Iowa Grant. So, weird as it sounds, obviously Iowa Grant is playing much better. They might be the most improved team in the entire area from the start of the year to now. But obviously Peck Argyle and I've done it again. The Blue Golds. That's the reason. The Blue Golds are obviously not out of it yet. And Saturday's game, which I know you're going to talk about shortly, is really going to probably get close to an elimination game for one of those teams as far as getting into the playoffs.
Yeah, I agree. Let's talk about that Seneca Wazeeka Steuben game against Peck Argyle on Saturday on 97.7 Country WGLR. Kind of what you mentioned before, that heading into the season, I thought Seneca Wazeeka Steuben was probably going to be the team that would be in that 4th place spot, just kind of based on who they had coming back and how they played over the last couple seasons. But as you said, Iowa Grant coming out of nowhere, especially after they played how they played in the first game of the season that you got to see. This does feel like a bit of an elimination game, as you said, for potential, postseason spots. But I think it's a really interesting matchup stylistically with the way, Peck Argyle's wanting to, pass the football and, the kind of brand of football that Seneca Wazeeka Steuben plays.
Yeah, it definitely is. It could end up being a very long game. I'm going to have to check to see if I have anything on my schedule Saturday night afterwards, because I may be late for it. And the other thing, of course, for one thing, it's the great Six Rivers tradition of Saturday homecoming games, which I absolutely love. But as we have seen over the years, sometimes it's homecoming, and B, when it's a Saturday game and you're playing out of your schedule, things tend to be a little different, possibly, not turn out the way you think they're supposed to. And if I'm not mistaken about this, I believe Peck Argyle actually has 3 Saturday games this year, because they also have their Argyle game, homecoming game, but they're also playing at Blackhawk Warren's homecoming game Saturday in South Wayne. So they're playing 6 Friday games and 3 Saturday games, which I'm sure for a practice schedule is a little bit difficult to deal with, especially when you play a game on Saturday and you got one less day to prepare for Friday. But it's at this point, it's kind of hard to say how Saturday is going to turn out, just because of that they've done some things that were not expected, positively and negatively. And, yet they find themselves in a decent position to make the playoffs with, like half the season gone as of halftime today or on Friday. So hard to say.
Yeah, very very intriguing matchup. I'm curious to see how that game plays out on Saturday on 97.7 Country WGLR. The Friday night games in the Six Rivers. Riverdale is at River Ridge for River Ridge's homecoming. And then Blackhawk Warren is at Iowa Grant, and Boscobel is at Potosi Cassville. That's the Six Rivers recap and preview for this week. Let's jump into the Ridge and Valley 8-player conference where, again, we were kind of curious to see if anyone would put up a fight against the Highland Cardinals, who had been dominant through the first 2 games of the season, and they had a tough test against Wisconsin Heights. Highland did come away with the win, 36-28. Kickapoo Lafarge took down Belmont 26-12. North Crawford a winner over DeSoto 14-8 in a tight ball game, and Wanawak Weston taking down Monticello 42-14. And a number of games in the Ridge Valley 8-player coming up on Saturday. The only Friday night game, Highland is at Kickapoo Lafarge. And then on Saturday, Belmont is at Wanawak Weston, Monticello is at North Crawford, and Wisconsin Heights is at DeSoto. Maybe a bit of a stunner in the sense that Belmont lost by 2 scores to Kickapoo Lafarge, but Highland, again, staying at the top of the Ridge Valley 8-player conference over Wisconsin Heights. And, I don't know if it's necessarily a, quote unquote wake up call for Highland, but Gary, as you and I saw when they played against Belmont, that offense sure as heck seems to be firing, and maybe Wisconsin Heights is maybe a team that maybe they're better than what their record says that they are.
Yeah, when we saw Highland against Belmont, Highland pretty much did what they wanted, when they wanted, and how they wanted. Belmont did the best they could as far as putting up resistance, but just wasn't a whole lot of it. Against Wisconsin Heights, again, Bennett Smith, an outstanding night, 302 yards passing. And, he has such a fluid motion and throws a really nice ball. So, it's not hard for his receivers. Kreisinger, 144 yards receiving. So I think they might have woke up a little bit with the closeness of the score, but I really doubt that, other than maybe DeSoto, that Highland's going to face much of a challenge in the 8-man.
Yeah, I think North Crawford's another big threat. The reigning conference champion, and they're still undefeated through 3 games as well. So, yeah, that'll be fun matchups down the line to see how Highland matches up with North Crawford and a team like DeSoto. Really curious to see how those games play out. So let's move into our teams of the week. I'll throw it around the horn. I'll start off with Matthew, then Gary, then Steve. Matthew, who is your team of the week for week 4?
My team of the week for week 4 is the Prairie du Chien Blackhawks. They took on Platteville last week, and Platteville, who got a bounce back win the week before, they absolutely got shut out by Prairie du Chien. Prairie du Chien was led by Blake Thierry, who had an absolutely insane performance. 3 receptions, 44 yards, 20 rushes for 211 yards, and 4 rushing touchdowns. So leaning on him and really the rest of that running staff that they're going to lean on throughout the season. Their total rushing unit had 50 attempts for 376 yards. So very impressive for them, and I think they're in the driver's seat in the SWC for the foreseeable future.
All right, I like it. Gary, your team of the week.
Well, I'm going to go along with Prairie du Chien. That's who I had picked. You keep TJ Pink at 100 yards under what he generally averages as far as passing yardage. There just wasn't much of a running game for the Hillmen. Prairie du Chien has shown a lot. And as we said before, I think it's going to come down to the, depending on how Platteville Lancaster fares out, but I think it's going to come down to the final week of the season for Prairie du Chien and Lancaster.
All right, Steve, your team of the week.
Well, I suppose I could say Prairie du Chien like everybody else, but I think I'd like to say Potosi Cassville, because that was a big win for them, beating their arch rivals, River Ridge, and kind of step 1 of getting the conference title in terms of beating the teams that everybody thinks are going to be the challengers, I guess, basically for the Six Rivers title. And Potosi Cassville was able to do that. It wasn't a dominating performance, but you don't get that basically in games like that. Mm-hmm. So actually, I think Potosi Cassville is going to be my choice. And I will throw you even an honorable mention one that probably will be way out of left field and will seem strange, but Wanawak Center Weston won a football game on Saturday, and they have, they co-opt, they went 8-player. It hasn't gone well for them in either sense, but they got to win. And yeah, they beat a team that's a brand new program, Monticello, but they got to win. I have to believe that everybody in the 3 communities, Wanawak, Union Center, and the Weston School District, Cazenovia, and Lime Ridge, by the way, has to be very happy about that.
Yeah, I like that. The team that I'll submit for Team of the Week, it's not necessarily for just their performance last week, but over the last 2 weeks. How about Iowa Grant? How they've turned things around after the first 2 weeks of the season, losing to Fenimore 42-0, and then losing to Dodgeville 38-8. They've won 2 games in a row, 28-24 against Seneca Wazeeka Steuben, and then a 38-16 win last week against Peck Argyle. So you talk about a team that's turned things around rather quickly. Iowa Grant, flexing their muscle early on in the Six Rivers Conference and tied with Potosi Cassville and Blackhawk Warren at the top of the Six Rivers standings through 2 weeks of conference play. Let's move into our players of the week, and same order, Matthew, any player or players that you think are worthy of our player of the week nomination?
Well, throughout the night tonight, I've already talked about Blake Thierry. I mentioned Tyson Richard and his impressive performance against Mineral Point. But for my player of the week, at the top of that ladder, I'm going to go with Owen Sefrud from Blackhawk Warren. 9 attempts, 211 yards. So he averaged almost 25 yards per rushing attempt. He had 5 touchdowns, ran for 3 2-point conversions, received a 2-point conversion catch, and got an interception. So he could do more than just wrestle. Pretty impressive football player.
Yeah, he does not skip leg day. I can definitely say that. Gary, your player of the week.
Well, I was torn, so I'm going to go with players of the week for mine, and they all come from Potosi Cassville. Isaiah Groom had probably, I consider, one of the best defensive games of anybody this past week. 6 solo tackles, 32 total tackles in one game, and then right along with him, River Sauer with 17 total tackles, and Danny, I'm going to butcher this, Esposito, with 14 tackles, total tackles. So, I mean, you've got, 60 tackles between 3 individuals on the defensive side for Potosi Cassville. And pulling out a 2-point win, Potosi Cassville needed every bit of that.
Yeah, I like it. Steve, your players of the week.
Yeah, I'm going with Blake Thierry for Prairie du Chien. And, when you go over 200 against anybody on the ground, especially in this era where everybody seems to run out of the spread and throw it and all that. They are just an I formation team and just will pound, although Thierry runs very effectively outside also. And it's not hard to figure out why he's going to be playing Division I football in Indiana next year, because he catches balls, he runs. He's not incredibly fast guy, but 225 pounds is pretty hard to tackle. He's a good player on defense also. So he is my pick this week.
All right. I will go with the same game that Gary was talking about, but I'm going to go with the opposing team. I'm going to go with River Ridge's Andrew Nice as our player of the week there. Keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, he missed the postseason matchup in Level 2 last year due to injury, and he made his presence felt in the regular season matchup this year. 30 rushing attempts for 135 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. Also had 1 catch for 13 yards and a receiving touchdown. Had 13 tackles on the defensive side and a forced fumble. So an outstanding stat line and a key reason why River Ridge was in the game against Potosi Cassville last week. So a lot of great players, certainly worthy of our player of the week nod this week. And now let's move into Steve's High Five, where again, Steve kindly ranks our teams in the area 1 through 5, and the rest of us mercilessly tell him why he's wrong. So, Steve, let's go through your high five for this week after week 4 of action.
Well, I can tell you first that whatever reaction you have to this list, I got booed by upwards of 100 people Monday, if you read the Platteville Journal for that. So if you think you're going to upset me, you're wrong.
It was only 100?
Yeah, well, read the paper, Gary. So at any rate, I have Potosi, Cassville, for obvious reasons, again, at number 1, and moved Prairie to Chien up to 2nd because they were certainly had a very impressive performance. Blackhawk Warren, similar impressive performance. They're 3rd. And then I have Darlington 4th and Cuba City 5th. Somewhat easier this week just because of how things have panned out. The team that's on the out but can move in is Lancaster. I wasn't quite sure where to get them to fit, but certainly if things change up above them and they win on Friday, they have a good chance of rejoining the high 5.
Well, as much as it pains me to do. Well, go ahead, Tyler.
Oh, go ahead, Gary.
I was going to say, as much as it pains me to do, I have to kind of agree with you on those, Steve. Lancaster, I would be a little more hesitant as far as how close they would be to the top 5, simply because of the 2 games that I've seen them in, the Cuba City matchup, and then how they played against Richland Center. I mean, they've got to be in the conversation for in that, obviously, top 7, 8. But I personally wouldn't put them that close to the top 5.
Yeah, the only thing that I would maybe consider doing is swapping Blackhawk Warren and Darlington, just because Darlington did beat Southwestern East Dubuque and Blackhawk Warren lost. And we should note that Southwestern East Dubuque was in the high 5 last week, but with the loss to Darlington, they fall out. And I would imagine that if Southwestern East Dubuque were to beat Cuba City, they're back in the high 5 as well. But I think overall the high 5, I think we're in pretty good standing with that. We don't have Rob Spangler on our show this week for him to tear into you mercilessly. Matthew, your thoughts on the high 5?
Better than last week, I'll give you that. But I think it is pretty solid this week. The one thing that I might offer is part of me would consider swapping Cuba City and Darlington in the sense that I think Cuba City has more options that they can go to on offense, on the ground, and through the air. I'm really excited for when those 2 teams play each other, and I think the gap that exists there is really small. So not upset about Darlington being ranked above Cuba City. And I would also caution saying that Lancaster is the number 6 team, especially with the way that they played earlier in the season in a couple of those games. I think, as Gary said, they're up there, but 6 might be a little too high for me. But if we keep it with just the high 5, pretty solid.
All right, so that is this week's Steve's high 5, and we will close out the show with a new contest that we are unveiling with the episode this week. It is the Papa Murphy's of Platteville and Prairie du Chien 2024 High School Football Mascot Challenge. It's a really fun way to see who has or had the best high school football mascots in the area. We ranked the current and previous high school football mascots 1 through 46 in a bracket style format, where you can head to any of our Queen Bee Radio websites to vote. You can vote as many times as you'd like. The winning team will get a pizza party courtesy of Papa Murphy's of Platteville and Prairie du Chien. In addition to the current version of high school mascots, we also have blasts from the past. So if you were an alum of a school, say West Grant or Bloomington, which is now part of the River Ridge School District, you can vote for your mascot from when you were at school. Just complete the form on our Queen Bee Radio websites and vote as many times as you would like. There's going to be 6 rounds of voting until we have one undisputed high school football mascot champion. All of you guys have seen the initial brackets that came out. I'll start off with you, Matthew. What do you think of this, and what are some of the things that stood out to you?
Well, first of all, I think it's really exciting. It's kind of a cool way to see some of the different fans in our area debate whose mascot is better. I think it's going to be interesting to see, too, the different dynamic of voters and what they bring to the table each time they cast their vote in terms of who's going to vote for their fan base, who's going to make it a point to vote against their rivals, and who's just straight up going to pick who they think is the cooler mascot. Some of my thoughts on looking at the bracket immediately is you've got Lancaster and Darlington ranked pretty high. Cool mascots, good football success, and really passionate fan bases. So I would assume that they're going to do very well in this. Some of the cool mascots I'm keeping my eye on, the Cassville Comets and the Benton Zephyrs, both very cool. The Southwestern East Dubuque Warcats, that is exactly what a co-op name should be. Make it really cool, mashup of the two, get both of those schools involved in there. And then one thing I'm really happy to see in this mascot challenge is some of the old schools in there, the Spring Green Shamrocks and the Cobb Colonel, some really cool names. And I'll leave you with one more thing. One team, besides my Mineral Point Pointers, that I'm going to be rooting for is a school that no longer exists kind of in my backyard, the Rui Eagles. My grandma, who's 96 years old, was the valedictorian from Rui High School in the class of 1946, the starting left fielder on the softball team in her graduating class of 9 people.
That is awesome. And
Go
since
Eagles.
you did bring up about, how they're seeded, the seeding was determined based on state championships, state championship game appearances, the selection committee and computer rankings. We used a BCS type of system. Think of the BCS as, what you see. Maybe you're too young for the BCS, Matthew. We'll, bring you up to speed on that. But, and we should also mention that for the sake of this competition, and this stems from a one-on-one with a great one interview that I had with Mark Siegert at Potosi-Cassville. Potosi-Cassville does not have an official mascot for their football team, so they are the number 46 team in this bracket. Now, keep in mind, this is all, through voting. So if you don't think that your team was seated correctly, or if you, have, a grievance with the way that things are, playing out initially, encourage your friends and family to vote. You can vote your way out of it. Democracy at its finest. Steve, and then Gary, your thoughts on this mascot challenge, the brackets, and seeing some of the old school teams, in the mix with this. I think it's a really fun dynamic with this contest that we're doing.
Oh, that's a great idea. Whoever came up with it. I guess I can see the seedings. I could have an argument about, well, why is this, or whatever. But we'll pass on that. And I'll point out too, the Platteville Hillmen, because they are one of, I believe, 2 high schools in the state of Wisconsin who have a mascot who is an actual person, and it was Wilford Hill, who coached football and basketball and baseball and track at Platteville High School from the 40s into before that, into the 60s. The reason Platteville used to be called the Cardinals, they were called the Cardinals initially, but newspapers in those days would often give teams kind of alternate nicknames that in many cases were tied to the name of their coach. And so at one point in, I believe, the 1930s, the student body at Platteville High School decided that, birds are birds, let's name the teams for Coach Hill. Of course, this is in the days when there was no organized girls athletics. Title IX had not taken, was way, way off. So the teams were called the Hillmen, and they were still called that today. And that's, I think, a particularly unique piece of history for Platteville. Then the other team that I think I'll be rooting for with this is a school that does not exist anymore, and probably the building doesn't exist anymore. But how can you not root for the New Diggings Midgets?
Fair point. Yeah. How can you not? But but yeah, I think it's really cool. Patch Grove Beavers, is in the competition. The West Grant Falcons, many of my in-laws were part of that school before all those schools combined to create River Ridge. So it's kind of a cool nostalgic factor. And then again, kind of recognizing the success that a lot of those schools, have had. We're so used to the, current day, schools that are, that are set up, but kind of giving a nod to some of the old teams and schools that were in the area that no longer exist. I thought that this is a really cool twist to this mascot challenge campaign. Gary, I know that you're taking a look at this as well. What do you think initially looking at this?
Well, I think this is an awesome idea, whoever came up with this. And I haven't, to be honest, I haven't had a chance to really look at this much, but one of them that catches my eye that you've almost got to kind of go along and root for a little bit. Back here paired up with the Rui Eagles, which I had never heard of. The Fenimore Mighty Midgets are in there as well. So I think it's great. It's going to bring I think it's going to bring a lot of attention to a under-recognized facet of the game. A lot of the guys are people that are actually mascots. I mean, they run around, they take a lot of abuse. I know a couple of the people that used to be Henry Hillman up here, for mascots, and they do quite the job. So I'm interested to see how this plays out.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun. The first round voting open now through Tuesday. We'll have the votes tabulated for Wednesday, and we'll release the next round of brackets coming up on Thursday. Again, you can go to any one of our Queen Bee Radio websites, WGLR.com, X1071.com, SuperHits106.com, and AM1590 WPVL.com to cast your vote for your favorite or voting against your least favorite mascots in Southwest Wisconsin. A really cool competition that we have here, and really excited. It'll be about 6 weeks long. We have 6 rounds of voting set up with the brackets the way that they're set up. So we'll certainly have some discussions about that. Maybe we'll have Steve give us a history lesson on some of these older schools as well, because he has that type of information in his preparation and game prep for everything that he does. So
how long do you want these programs to last, Tyler?
Right.
No offense, Steve.
But yeah, again, check out the 2024 high school football mascot challenge. Thanks to Papa Murphy's of Platteville and Prairie du Chien for sponsoring this competition and putting up a pizza party for the winning team. So looking forward to seeing how that plays out. And that wraps up this week's edition of the high school football roundup. Thanks again to Papa Murphy's for sponsoring the show. Papa Murphy's $7.99 everyday value lineup is a big deal for a small price. Talking a large pizza with new shredded pepperoni, crumbled sausage, or classic cheese for $7.99 each, which means that you can afford big-time deliciousness at Papa Murphy's of Platteville and Prairie du Chien. And then just to recap the games that we have coming up this weekend on Queen Bee Radio, on Super Hits 106 and the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel, Cuba City at Southwestern East Dubuque, 97.7 Country, WGLR and the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. It is Platteville at Lancaster. On Extreme 107.1, Fenimore at Galena. And then on Saturday, Seneca Wazeeka Steuben at Peck Argyle on 97.7 Country, WGLR. For Gary, Matthew, and Steve, I'm Tyler Diktanas. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week for a new episode of the Papa Murphy's in Platteville and Prairie du Chien High School Football Roundup.